coming today to listen to this presentation. I know this is one of my favorites to present, and it's one of the ones that we get the most views of because I think reviewing the literature is one of those tasks in the capstone writing process that is probably the most challenging, given the amount of material that you're trying to integrate into your work. And the complexity and kind of evolving nature of that process. So I hope that this presentation leaves you with some practical tips and tricks and ideas going forward and helps you, go towards your goals. I'm Carrie Little Brown, and I am one of the form and style editors in the Walden Writing Center. And if you're not familiar with the form and style review, what that is a supportive review that every doctoral capstone goes through near the end of the capstone process before the oral conference and after one of the final URR reviews, where we look at the whole document for overall clarity, grammar, lots of mechanical things, formatting, APA, and give you some feedback to guide your final revision so that you have a really top-notch publishable document ready to go to ProQuest at the end of the process. So that's what I've been doing. I've been with Walden since 2012, and do contact my group if you have any questions about this issue or session, as you think about it in the days to come. But let's get going. So as I said, this webinar is really meant to provide some practical ideas and help to guide that literature review writing process. And so the objectives are as follows. To think about and understand the purpose and the goals of the literature review. What is it there to accomplish? I think that kind of grounding can help in thinking about how to structure that and approach it. We'll talk about resources for managing and organizing information in the literature review. We'll talk about in detail with some concrete examples, paraphrasing and synthesizing the literature, and the ways in which doing that effectively really determines how effective your overall literature review is. We'll talk about strategies for organizing and revising the literature review, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A and some discussion of resources that may be particularly useful to you in the writing process of the literature review at Walden. If you have any questions as we go along, as Beth said, do feel free to put those in the Q&A box. And my colleague Megan Irving is here in the background answering questions. She's also one of the form and style editors. So please let us know if there's anything you'd like us to clarify or expand on. All right, so to get going, I find that it really helps me to know who's in the audience. Beth is going to launch a poll that just asks to give an idea of what your current stage is in the doctoral capstone writing process. Like, are you still taking coursework? Are you working on that prospectus document? Are you writing the proposal chapters or sections or wrapping up the final study? Or are you almost done and working on those really final stages? So we'll give that a few minutes to give you a chance to enter some answers there. Okay, and it's looking like, as I would expect, most people are working on the proposal. Which chapters or sections that is, of course, varies by the specific capstone document, but that is the part that includes the literature review. So that would make sense. And there's a good group of you who are also writing the prospectus. And so this should be very helpful to you as well. You'll be working on some basic ideas within the prospectus that will be obviously instrumental in filling out that literature review later, and a few people still in coursework. All right. And Beth, you can close that one whenever you think you've gotten all the answers. Thank you for letting me know. That just lets me get a good idea of who the audience is and what will be most relevant to you. So we'll start with just a quick overview of the purpose and goals of the literature review. So there's several things that students do or student writers do at the doctoral level with literature in a capstone and functions that that serves. So of course, in some of these are obvious and some are perhaps less obvious. The literature serves to provide background and context. I think that's what we think of most readily when we think about the literature review. You're providing that kind of background information to situate your study in the history of the field. It's also an appeal to scholarly authority, showing that you've done that work to find the scholarly work in your field and convincing other people that your work is reliable because you are calling upon those things to support the statements that you're making. And in extension to that, you're verifying and justifying the assertions that you're making when you're citing the literature in your work. In doing those things, you're also addressing that broader academic audience by situating the work in the context of your field and part of the larger academic discussion. And then the last, function of the literature review in the dissertation or doctoral study specifically, again, is really establishing that you've done the work to establish that subject matter expertise so that people coming to your document perceive you as credible, as an authority in that area. And I think it also in that your dissertation or doctoral study is the evidence of your doctoral work kind of out in the world on ProQuest, published for people to see. It establishes your credibility in a broad way as an academic. And what is the literature review? The literature review is both, sort of the act of creating literature review is both an act of collecting relevant literature and importantly, analyzing that literature. So it's collection and analysis of those literature materials on a given topic. And we like to say that one detail about that is that there's attention in the literature review to the currency and credibility of the sources. And we'll talk in a while about the kinds of sources that go into the literature review specifically, um, and why that underscores the currency and credibility aspect of that literature. Essentially, it presents what's known about the topic, and it should lead ideally up to what is not known about that topic. And that's going to be that gap in existing literature that you've probably heard, repeated many times that your study is filling or going to fill. So there's a sort of dual purpose of, or dual set of purpose and goals in the literature review in presenting this literature. First, is sort of instructional. You're teaching your readers about your study topics so that they understand where your work is situated in this field. So you're presenting the state of the field, the background and history and so on of that field, foundational key seminal studies in your area. A summary of current ideas and debates should be emerging from your literature review so that people get a sense of the overall conversation that's happening in that field. Any recent studies that have been done. And within the literature that you review, as we'll discuss later, there's a focus on, really presenting the most recent scholarship in that area so that you're indicating that your work is fully up to date and contributing up in the present moment. And typically, the window of the research that you should focus on varies a bit by program. It's generally in the most recent 3 to 5 years. And all of that, again, all that background information is leading up to that gap in literature that your study is positioned to fill. You're also trying to present a full picture of your topic. And so when we say that, there should be, some kind of fully fleshed out nature of the way that you're presenting it. It should have some balance. So you're presenting studies that support your statements and focus, as well as some that oppose that focus. Again, drawing out that idea of the kind of conversation or debate that's happening in the area that you're now contributing to. The goal in establishing all of this literature and gathering all of this is to demonstrate that you have reached saturation. And you've probably heard that term too in your coursework, talking about the point at which you're not. It's a sort of slippery thing to define, and there's always questions about how do I know when I've reached that saturation point in reviewing the literature, gathering sources. And there's not a super easy answer to that, of course, but the most straightforward thing to say is it's the point at which you're not really generating new information, new themes, new important ideas from the work that you're reviewing when the same themes are coming up over and over. And the number of sources that that involves is really going to vary by field. Um, but that is the goal, is to reach that point where you're not generating a lot of radically new information as you look at new sources. We often talk about the literature review process as being circular or iterative, and those of you who are already writing the literature review have probably already discovered this or are experiencing this right now. That it's a cycle that starts with, in the library, or doing your research, locating the literature, reading and taking notes. And then an important step that we'll talk about in some detail in this session is organizing those notes. And I'll talk about how you can use a matrix if you're not already doing so to make that really effective and kind of set you up to be really well prepared to write a well synthesized literature review. Because the next step then is synthesis, showing that you understand the sources well enough that you can teach them to another person, which is on a practical level what you're doing in presenting the literature in your literature review. And then, we say, and that goes into once you've established that kind of mental understanding of the literature, you're writing that synthesis out. Then you go through various processes of revision, and then typically you're getting feedback indicating things you need to expand or contract in the literature review. You're realizing yourself you want to investigate more things that are pertinent to your topic that are coming up in the sources. And then you're kind of back there at the beginning, and it will sort of continue until that work is complete. We'll launch a poll in just a moment about which aspects of the literature review seem most challenging to you, whether you're looking at that process or going into it. So we'll do that now. I've put a few ideas here of the kinds of things that we see people really struggling with or asking questions about. If you have something else that is your particular challenge that you'd like to share, you're welcome to share that in the chat box that popped up. I think that could be interesting to see. But this question is just asking which aspects of the literature review writing process seem most challenging to you? Which do you struggle with the most or think that you might struggle with the most when you get into that part of your writing? And I'll give that a bit longer to give you a chance. And I'm seeing a lot of people saying that organizing the material is most daunting. I know personally that's one of the things I find most difficult. Is that sort of macro process of putting that together, and we'll be addressing that definitely in this presentation. Quite a few people saying that paraphrasing and avoiding plagiarism, is a significant issue. I see, about 11% of you saying dealing with faculty feedback and the revision process is challenging. And I know it is. This is the longest writing process that a lot of people have pursued at this point. Not everyone. Some people have already written work of this length by the time they're writing the doctoral capstone. But for a lot of us, this is the first time we've written something of this length that's had this many reviewers and this much feedback, and it is challenging. And I see some other chat comments coming in. Um, some things about the literature search, knowing when to stop looking for articles, and we'll talk a bit about some library resources we can direct you to that might be helpful. Um, making sure that you're avoiding unintentional plagiarism. Um, this is an interesting comment about knowing how far to go down the rabbit hole on each of your subtopics. And hopefully we'll address all of these things. If you find that you have any unanswered questions after this session, do feel free to contact us. Right,
Carrie,
and
oh,
I
go
see
ahead,
some
Megan.
comments about frustration about the approval process and reviews.
I'm not seeing anything too much,
So thank
so
you everyone for
unless
sharing. I
Beth,
think we're
you'd
going
caught
to close
something that
out
you'd
the
like to
poll.
have addressed, I think
Yeah,
we're all
same. All the questions thus far seem pretty specific.
Right, and as we go along, as I've said, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box. I've told Beth and Megan to feel free to interrupt me at any point, too, if there's anything I can clarify or explain or answer. And actually, in that vein, Beth or Megan, is there anything, I can't see the Q&A box right now. Is there anything I should address before we go forward? Okay, thanks so much. All right, so I saw that the top answer in that poll, thank you for answering that, was about organizing the literature review. So this first section in this part of the presentation, we'll address that in some detail, and hopefully we'll leave you with some ideas. So the majority of the sources in your literature review, and this is not news to most of you because you've probably heard this repeated again emphatically and often, are recently scholarly and peer-reviewed journal articles. And that means they've gone through that formal process of peer review. They're printed in academic journals using that, sort of academic discourse. The percentage of I know we often get a question about which percentage is it of peer-reviewed journal articles published within the last 5 years or, whatever, that I need to use in my literature review. That kind of requirement is going to be articulated by your program. So I would check with your program documents and rubrics for that if you have questions about that. Or consult with your chair about where to find that information. That will vary, but the vast majority of the work that you're going to be citing in the doctoral capstone is going to be those scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles. There are, of course, other sources that are brought into the dissertation and that can be relevant and useful. When you're developing your theoretical or conceptual framework, for instance, there's going to be often seminal foundational works that might be quite a bit older than that, that might be books, other kinds of publications, and those are typically fine to cite. Again, your chair can help clarify what sort of literature is and is not appropriate. There's, to a limited extent, different kinds of reports, other dissertations or doctoral studies, other kinds of literature may be helpful, different kinds of online resources, but the majority will always be those recent scholarly, I keep wanting to say recent scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles. We can't provide in this session a lot of information to guide your literature search because we want to give that to the people who are really most qualified to help you with that, who are going to be the Walden librarians. And with that in mind, there's some links here on this slide that you could link, even now if you wanted to, or after this session if you download the slides, which I'd encourage you to do to have as resources. Of links to resources at the Walden Library that are especially helpful in the lit review process. The librarians are great about making themselves available in a lot of different formats to really try to reach out to as many students as they can. So there's a link here to that Ask a Librarian page, which gives you all the different ways to contact them with your questions about your search. They have lots of also resources on their website like tutorials and webinars that are linked here. They have information on citation management software, things like Zotero that we often get questions about that We aren't unfortunately trained in the Writing Center to support that, but they do have training in the library. And so they can give you a little more information about things like Zotero to manage your citations and do some APA formatting in a more automated way. And there's a link here to the part of their website that addresses that, as well as some webinars you might want to look at of theirs. What we deal with more here in the Writing Center is kind of helping to manage information and notes to move toward or scaffold that writing process. And so that's what we'll talk about in a bit more detail now. One important point that, seems obvious, but I think is a good thing to remember is that there's, I think a lot of us struggle with, trying to avoid plagiarism. And I think in the majority of things that I've seen in, a very long time of editing dissertations and doctoral studies, and in my, I think it's 8 years at Walden, is that, a lot of people end up with issues with their literature review being a bit too close to the source material. And in the vast majority of cases, I don't think that that's intentional. I think a lot of it is sort of a information or data management sort of issue, having to do with sometimes, frankly, in your notes, it's unclear which things, and I deal with this myself. We know which of this is my own language and which of this sentence that I've written here is straight out of the source. And so a couple of things to think about. This is a practical measure to protect yourself against accidentally using too much original language out of the sources, to keep copies of your original sources. I know I keep, I just save a PDF into my files of everything that I use in any kind of academic work that I do. Or, if you like to print those out and have those physically, that's good too. And then, too, in your notes, importantly, use quotation marks around anything that you're writing down that is taken directly from the source word for word, and put citations next to those. That will just make your work a lot easier, and it helps to protect you against inadvertently taking something longer than a multi-word phrase or sentence that really needs to be credited to a source for its language. It will prevent you from taking that as your own without realizing it. Another really important tool that I mentioned near the beginning that we want to dig into a little bit, for those of you who might not already be using it or want some new ideas for it, is a literature review matrix. And I know in a lot of the courses at Walden, you might have done worked on a matrix that may be helpful to you now. We have some general matrix templates. And what that is basically a way to organize your notes as you go through your sources. And you can customize it to really make it as detailed as you want to, and as functional in different ways as you want to suit your own needs. What a matrix will do for you is help you in making connections across sources as you organize the literature review. And we'll look at some examples here in a moment of what that might look like. Those are available on the Writing Center website. And we have templates that we have examples up there that you can see what one looks like filled out, which is what we're going to look at now. We also have blank templates that you can use and customize in Word or Excel, depending on what you're more comfortable with. And we'll look at that now. So this is the literature review matrix in Microsoft Word. This is just the sample one that we have up on your website to kind of give you an idea of what you can do. And the template is sort of similar to this. As you can see, it's just a table, but in Word, there's going to be a smaller number of columns, but it's a way to pull out those major elements of each article that you read or each source that you read so that you can start looking for commonalities across sources. And of course, just using table tools, you can add or delete columns, you can change the categories. This one has things like, you have your citation information, it's just author and date here. Um, the theoretical and conceptual framework. So if you needed to find, all of the sources that are using the same theory that you are, when you're talking about that theory in your literature review, you could go through this table and easily do that. There's a column for methodology and so forth. So you can get an idea of how this might be useful in drawing connections across sources. Excel, of course, being a spreadsheet, is a lot more powerful for organizing data. I will be completely honest. I am I am a writer editor type person, and so I'm a lot more comfortable in Word, but I am always promising myself I will become more proficient in Excel because truly for a task like organizing a really large amount of data, a large amount of literature, it can be really helpful and a powerful mechanism for searching out terms and sorting things to put like things together. Um, and there's an example on our website of when you go to that, if you go to that link for the matrices, of how someone had used like two-letter codes to mark things like, theoretical constructs or something that they wanted to find in every work that it occurred in. And that would let them really easily sort the data using tools in Excel in the spreadsheet to rearrange the information automatically. So this can be, a pretty powerful tool for finding those commonalities across sources. And an effective literature review, as I said, really does put your sources in conversation. It draws those connections across them. And it also shows how the past literature is relevant to the writer's own study. And so with a matrix, you can more easily see what your sources have in common, again, by looking down those columns, by sorting if it's a spreadsheet. And then making those connections is going to be the key to strong synthesis. And so that's what we'll talk about next, what synthesis really means in the doctoral capstone literature review specifically, and how paraphrasing plays a role in making that synthesis more robust. So you might have seen a slide like this if you've been to our residency presentations or perhaps in your courses, if they've had Writing Center material. We often like to talk about a distinction between summary and synthesis. And I think that's really helpful in thinking about what the goal is in the literature review. So when we talk about summary, that's going to be typically a kind of source-based sort of discussion. So sort of what you might do in an annotated bibliography. You are giving a brief description of the main ideas within a source, typically one source at a time. You're telling a brief story of each source when you're writing in summary mode. When you're writing in synthesis mode, you are connecting sources. It doesn't go source by source by source, typically. It's going to go kind of idea by idea by idea. And it's a more extended explanation of the ideas, trends, themes, theories, among multiple sources. So you're combining multiple sources, not to tell the story of those sources, but to tell the story of your topic. And that's what you do in literature review. Now, of course, in the literature review, there are elements of summary that's inevitable. If you're talking about, say, the development of a specific theory that is key to your own work, you might talk about the people who originally developed that theory in more of a summary mode. But the overall aim of the work is always going to be synthesis. We sometimes talk about something called, you might have heard called synthesis language. And I think that sounds more complicated and fancy than what I think we're trying to get at with that. And so this slide shows, really some very simple ways that you can signal synthesis. And what I mean by that is just signaling the connections between sources, signaling the connections between the sources and your own work. And so the bolded terms in this slide draw out some of the real easy ways that you can use language to pivot between sources and show that you have synthesized those ideas together, seeing the relationships between them. So in the first example here, Martinez reported results consistent with findings in Tan's and Deng's studies, consistent with signal synthesis because it's showing how Martinez related to this other literature in the body of work. You can also, show that you're doing something additive by saying, likewise, also noted. You can show contrast with things like differed and contrasted. But they're just very simple ways that you can use transition terms and verbs to indicate the relationship and between sources in your work. Paraphrasing is also really the kind of core of effective synthesis. In an APA style, and I will be honest about this as well. I grew up and had my formative educational experiences, which are a really long time ago now, more in the humanities, where I like language and words, and I like other people's words, and so I like to use, properly cited but quotations. I am fond of quotations. direct quotations with quotation marks. In APA style writing and social science writing generally, that should be done very sparingly. And so I often have to pull myself back from wanting to write in that mode. Um, and part of the function of that is, being, brevity and so on. But from the perspective of synthesis, paraphrasing things in your own original words really does, I think, help to make sure that the ideas are well integrated into your overall argument and with the other sources that you're putting them in relationship with. Of course, it protects you against inadvertent plagiarism if you're not using quotation marks and so on correctly. But I think more even, as importantly, more importantly, it helps to bring those ideas into the overall conversation that you're presenting in your argument. So paraphrasing things in your own words really does help in clarifying how the information from the literature relates to your own work. Um, and so, again, avoiding excessive quotation, it's almost always better to rephrase things in your own words. But as you do so, be sure to credit sources, not just for any language that you're using with quotation marks and so forth and citations, but also any ideas that you're drawing. So it's also, of course, an academic integrity issue if you're presenting ideas from the literature without indicating where those ideas originated from, even if you've rephrased them. So just being certain to use APA compliant citations is, important whether you're citing words or ideas. And there's a link here to the some APA information on our website, and as well as some webinars that we have if you're wanting to look into paraphrasing in some more depth on paraphrasing source information and synthesis and thesis development. So if those are things you'd like more information on, want to think about in greater depth, check those links out. Now, synthesis, theoretically sounds like an easy thing to do, but I know even for experienced academic writers, it takes a lot of thought and work and revision and so forth. There are some common errors that we see at Form and Style, um, and that we might comment on and ask you to think about. So I thought I'd cover some of those here along with some simple solutions, and then we'll look at a few examples of what that looks like in practice, because I think it can become kind of abstract. I like to ground that in what some real writing might look like. So one error is that we see a lot in synthesis that's less effective is where, people may have, student writers will sometimes, be aiming to thinking like, okay, I don't want to devote, a paragraph, like, one author in one paragraph, another author in the next paragraph, and so forth, because that's not going to be, that's summary, that's not synthesis. So they'll put multiple authors in one paragraph, but then the error comes up when there's not really clear connections between them. So the reader wouldn't understand how do these things relate to each other? Why are they being put next to each other in this paragraph? So of course, the solution is presenting clearer relationships among those sources by including your own original analysis. And we'll look at some examples of what that might look like in a moment. By the same token, I think sometimes people will try to correct for that by forcing relationships between the sources that aren't necessarily logical or intuitive. And so that can be done by making broad, unsupported statements like most researchers agree. In academic writing, a statement like that typically is a signal that you might want to look deeper and see what kind of statement you could make that does have some literature support and is more specific. Because that's sufficiently broad, it might be hard to defend. Or statements like study X is just like study Y. That's unlikely to be the case. Those are sort of overly broad. So when you're correcting for that, you're looking for specific logical connections among your sources. So you can see some language that might be more effective. Author X's results aligned with author Y's in these ways, and then you'd be specific about that. Another error that we see sometimes is either back-to-back direct quotations or quotations just kind of dropped in the text without context. And we'll look at an example of that too. You want to be using paraphrasing and clear analysis to hold your ideas together. Oh, and I didn't, sorry. All right. So one error that we see is what's called stacked summaries, and that was that first thing in that table. That's where you're just kind of presenting the ideas of different authors without forging those connections between them within a paragraph. And there's an example here where I won't read all of this out, but Arnett, made an argument, about the dominance of American academic journals and what that had done to the field of psychology. And then it just goes right into Henrik et al. Contended that American samples in psychological research are not representative. Um, and then we see another Van de Viver, I think, advocated further internationalization of psychology. These ideas are related, but there's not clear relationships being forged between them. It's just sort of one author being presented after the next with a summary of what they said without any analysis to connect them. Another example of the kind of thing I was talking about in the table a couple slides ago are freestanding quotations put in text without any context. That tends to indicate a lack of synthesis. So, in this example, we see this whole sentence is a quotation. Now it is properly credited. It's not plagiarized. And there is a proper citation, but there's not any transition leading into it. There's not any context for kind of integrating this contribution from the literature with the person's own work. And there's also the question of, is it really necessary to use a direct quote here? Could this be paraphrased? That's another example of synthesis that could be improved. And by the same token, too many quotations, that over-reliance on direct quotations that I was confessing to myself, um, can really compromise the effectiveness of synthesis. So you see that in this example where you've got much of this paragraph is composed of direct quotations, and it's likely that those direct quotations aren't really necessary, that there be a way to paraphrase that more effectively, and in so doing, indicate the importance to your own work. So one strategy that I really like, and this comes, I believe, from Duke University originally. We have a lot of information on our website about it, but that is really helpful in structuring academic paragraphs, especially when you're talking about the literature, has the acronym MEAL. And if you've been to our sessions, you've likely run into this before. I think it is a useful tool to use, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in practical terms. So the acronym MEAL stands for the elements that you would want in most academic paragraphs, and certainly paragraphs that are dealing with the literature. A main idea, and that's usually your topic sentence. Evidence, that's what you're taking from the literature. Analysis, that's really the key to the synthesis. Your contribution that's indicating how those things relate to each other, how it relates to your work. And then the lead out. And as we'll see in the example, a lead out is not necessary. It's what serves as a pivot to the next paragraph. And I think that's probably the trickiest part of meal for people, because I think there's a temptation to feel like, oh, I need to now say at the end of this paragraph, next I'll talk about blank. And that usually is not the most effective way to do a lead out, just because it's not going to have the kind of flow that you would want in a paragraph. It's a little awkward. There are other ways that you can more subtly signal that you're kind of wrapping up one paragraph and moving to the next. And we'll look at an example in just a moment of one way you might do that. So here's a sample paragraph that shows the elements of meal in action. And then we'll go through this now in a little bit of detail, because I think this is one tool that's helpful for me. And I think especially if you're struggling with synthesis, if you're struggling to add enough context and clarity in your presentation of the literature, this can be a really helpful tool to go into your paragraphs and look and see, do I have each of these elements here in this paragraph? And if not, what do I need to add? So first of all, the M, that main idea, you want to make sure that each paragraph really does cohere around one major topic. And that's going to be captured in that main idea sentence. And often that will come at the beginning. It doesn't have to, but that's usually the easiest place for it. And here, this is over the last decade, there has been active discussion among scholars about the need for greater cultural diversity in the psychological research literature. That signals what this whole paragraph is going to be about. And then it goes into the evidence. And in this paragraph, for purposes um, of sort of demonstrating this to you, things are shown, the evidence and the analysis are shown in separate colors. In reality, those are often kind of interspersed, like together in the middle of the paragraph. Um, and some of that synthesis language kind of works for analysis too. But here we're seeing Arnett argued that the dominance of American journals in the field of psychology had led to the disproportionate representation of American samples, editors, and authors. And then here we have some synthesis language. So maybe this could even be purple here for analysis. Expanding upon this idea, Henrik et al. Contended that American samples in psychological studies, which often consist of undergraduate students, are notably atypical of the human species. Expanding upon this idea, it's a simple device, but it's linking Arnett's ideas to Henrik et al.'s ideas. It's helping forge that synthesis. And then the analysis piece here is in the purple italics. Indeed, the dominance of American institutions and publications in psychology appears to have created issues of cultural representation that place the universality of psychological research findings in doubt. That's some original analysis that links the ideas together, and it kind of alludes to how this is going to relate to the study without having to say anything directly. And then the final element here in green with the underline is the lead out. The solution to this problem in part may involve greater internationalization of the field. Now, this sentence doesn't say in summary, and repeat the paragraph. It doesn't say next I'll talk about blank, but I think it does provide um, a subtle way to kind of indicate what's going to be addressed next. Reading this, the reader is going to expect, oh, okay, we're going to talk about internationalization. And most likely that's what the next paragraph will begin to cover. Synthesis is, something that can be explored in a lot more depth than we can do in this presentation. And we've done a lot of materials on it in the Writing Center. Try to give you a lot of resources because it is something that I think a lot of us, revisit, struggle with, work on, really throughout an academic writing career. So do check out some other materials if you think that that would be helpful, if it's something you find yourself working on. We have videos on paragraphs and the meal plan that show some of these examples in some more depth, and you can link to that here. Excuse me, there's a webinar called Beyond Summary, Adding Analysis and Synthesis to Your Writing that again goes in a little more depth and draws out that summary synthesis distinction, and you can check that out. And we also have a guide to topic sentences that can be helpful if you're trying to make sure each paragraph coheres around a clear theme. All right, so from there we'll go into some strategies for organizing and revising the literature review. If you are early in the process, or not, but certainly if you're starting the process of thinking about writing your literature review, as you may already be well aware, it can really be helpful to begin by looking at your problem statement to think about what is this literature review going to contain. And one technique involves going through your problem statement and just highlighting those key concepts or variables, physically, electronically, or whatever, or writing those down. And then using those words or phrases to create the beginning of a literature review outline. Your problem statement is typically going to kind of contain the seeds of the main ideas of your literature review within the concepts or variables that you're talking about in that statement. And so those often can be mapped into a skeletal topic outline that you would then fill out with more detail, with headings and subheadings that could eventually be translated into the literature review itself. If you're interested in that process or thinking about that in your own work, we have something called a SMART guide, which is just a text tutorial. It's an acronym that some of my colleagues have come up with too for those tools, called Creating a Literature Review Outline that walks through the steps with some, concrete examples of how you would take the problem statement into a literature review in that way. So check that out if you think that that would be helpful to you. Now, as you're organizing the literature review, you want to be thinking again in terms of themes, not sources, because again, with Um, in synthesis and literature review, we're telling stories about topics. We're not telling stories about sources. So your research notes are going to be organized by source. Um, so, here's in this example here, we've got notes about what each author talked about. In your writing, of course, you wouldn't go through, you know, we wouldn't present it in that order. What you want to do is look at what do these authors have in common? How can I draw out themes from this and then present those themes in a logical way, drawing the authors in where each contributes to that theme. And so what you're doing is not taking those notes and then coming up with a thematic outline of those notes. So you can see from here, both author A and author B talk about the financial costs of single parenting. So that might be one subsection. And those two authors might be among the ones that you're discussing in that section. Author B and author C both talk about the interaction between socioeconomic status and parenting style. That might be some other section of your literature review that they come into and so forth. Now, as you're filling out the literature review, once you've outlined and so forth, you've figured out your heading structure, you're going to be, again, finding those sources that pertain to each thing, of course, and then making sure that you connect, sufficient source details to each heading. Mainly thinking about how do those sources teach readers about this part of your topic. And so you're only including those source details that are relevant to your study. I think sometimes people moving from like an annotated bibliography where they've really gone into detail about all the studies that they've read will bring in every detail about that study into the literature review. And that typically isn't necessary. Which aspects of that study do we need to know about? What aspects of the way in which it was conducted? Which aspects of the findings are pertinent to the work that you're doing? And so that's, I think, one thing to be thinking about as you're working on it, as you're writing it, as you're revising it. Do I have enough information here? Is it too much? Um, just a reminder here to acknowledge and refute counter arguments as you go through, thinking about, you know, which studies, which studies support your work and which studies don't, and why have you judged the supporting studies to be stronger? Why are you adopting that point of view? And then you're concluding the literature review in the same way that you would, it's helpful to think of the literature review like a critical essay, which it essentially is. It's a long one. That whole chapter functions like an essay, and then it has an introduction. It has a body where you have structured all of your literature into thematic sections, and then it has a conclusion. So you would conclude that in the same way that you would an effective paper with a summary of your key points. Reinforcing how those key points relate to your own work and the gap that you've identified in the literature, and then transitioning to the next section. Right, so as you're revising the literature review, as I alluded to earlier, that's a long process. I think as everything is in the doctoral capstone process where you have multiple people reviewing. So it can be really helpful to make a plan and stick to a schedule. And one key reminder in that is to include time not just for writing, but for the revision process. Writing is a written iterative process, and so is revising. So you want to prepare to adapt your structure as the literature review develops. And as you receive feedback. And that's where in that cycle, you might be going back and doing more research as you do get feedback. If I'm hesitating here, it's because some of our graphics, I don't, please ignore the 10 here. I think it was supposed to be a check mark. There's some software issues. My apologies. All right, and then you want to break the revision two into manageable and focused tasks. This is one of the most important things I've learned as a professional editor, is that when you're going through a document, when you're really trying to produce a professional, polished piece of work, it is almost never a good idea, especially something as long as a dissertation chapter or a doctoral study section or a doctoral study as a whole, to not try to do everything at once. And I find and we have some sessions you might have seen at residency where we talk about this. I find it very helpful to approach content revision, and by that I mean the big picture stuff. Revision for organization ideas, the order of elements, structure, what you've included, to approach that separately from the fine-tooth comb proofreading tasks. Um, I think there's a tendency to try to do that all at once. I think there's also sometimes a tendency to want to do the fine-tooth comb stuff before you've really established um, the content there. And for kind of the obvious sort of logical reason, I mean, I know personally, it is often more gratifying to go in and do the little proofreading details. It's more soothing. The content stuff is hard work, but that is what really needs to be done and taken care of first, just for the reason, the practical reason that if you've spent time proofreading material that you might cut later or move or change, then that's not necessarily time well spent. So generally, you want to be going in and doing that big picture work first, and then making sure you have, your own approval and faculty approval on the content. And then, you can go in and do the really fine-toothed work of getting it publication ready. We have a lot of resources for doctoral capstone writers. Just highlighting a few things here. This webinar is part of a larger doctoral capstone webinar series. We have webinars on each one of the major components of a dissertation or doctoral study. We have one on methods and presenting the results. We have material on the abstract. And all of that is available in our webinar archive. And then we show these live on a sort of rotating schedule throughout the year. So check out our page there to access the archive, and you can watch those anytime you want when you think it might be helpful to you. There are also something called doctoral capstone writing workshops. This, among the things I've shown today, this is the only thing that is not free. The doctoral capstone writing workshops do have a fee associated because it's a non-credit course being offered through the Center for Academic Excellence. I've heard wonderful things about them, though. I think if you're struggling with the writing process, you want a sort of community of writers and someone to look at your work in a real detailed way, it can be helpful. And the price point is a lot lower than regular courses as a kind of supportive non-credit course. So there's a link here if you're interested in checking those out. There's also a link here to the Form and Style website. That's
Sure,
the group
Carrie.
that I work
We had
with.
two
And
questions
we've assembled a
that we
lot of
kind of wanted you
resources
to
there for
address
you
for
related
everyone.
specifically to doctoral
The first one
capstone writing.
is
It's
whether
sort of a
every
sub area
paragraph
of the larger
should
Writing
use the
Center
meal
website.
plan,
And we also
particularly in the
have
literature
APA
review, but
style
kind of
and
over.
capstone formatting guidance and information on that form and style review that we conduct near the end of the capstone process, along with a checklist you can use if you're interested in, thinking about the kinds of things that we're going to look
All,
at and maybe making,
you know,
some of those corrections
if
early.
that makes sense.
You can access all of that there. So that comes to the end of this presentation, actually. I wanted to be sure to leave time for Q&A. I've seen movement in the Q&A box, but I wasn't able to read the questions. So I will invite, Megan or Beth to tell me now if there's anything that it would help for me to address with the group. Yeah, it does. And I think that's a question. It's a question I get a lot. It's one that I think about because, I initially, I think in my early years at the Writing Center, was maybe a meal plan skeptic because I'll be honest, I don't like real formulaic approaches to writing. It tends to be something, something I love. It's something that's often intuitive, but really for academic work, that model is a great one. It is not, there's nothing that requires that you use it. But I think that I would say throughout the literature review, especially, um, each of your paragraphs is going to need to have those elements. Now, of course, if you're writing, a paragraph where you're talking about, in that section where you talk about your search process, that's not going to, it doesn't make sense in that context because you're not bringing in, citations, into a discussion of which databases and search terms you used or something. So there are exceptions where it doesn't make sense. And there's no requirement that you implement that, but I think as a tool, and especially if you're really struggling with flow and organization and clarity and You're being asked to look at the organization of your topics. It's really helpful. I think in general, what it brings out too is that each paragraph really does have to have a coherent main idea. And that's one of the most common kinds of organizational things that I will ask students to think about or look at is, how many different ideas or themes have you crammed into maybe one really long paragraph? I think it's an easy thing to do, inadvertently, but it makes things a lot more difficult to follow for the reader. So I think in following Meal, you can make sure that you're really getting that clear flow of topics. And I think it helps to draw that out. And it can be helpful to use Meal again too on the work that you've already written that you might need to revise to think about, kind of reverse outlining that and seeing, do I have each of these elements here? And if not, if there's not a good reason I don't, what might I change? So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer or not, but that's my best answer.
Thanks, Carrie. That was our big one, our big two. I will
No, I mean, I will say, when we sometimes see,
just like follow up on
in the
what you were
Writing
saying.
Center,
I do know that the
there are
library,
those rare
one thing they can
occasions
help you set up
where
is
you might see
alerts
a
so that
150
when
page
new
literature
information on your
review, and I would
topic
say
gets
generally,
published, they'll let you,
in most cases
you
that
get a
is too
little
long,
alert so you can
but it's
kind
a
of have
very
an idea of what's
subjective, it's a subjective sort of thing because again, what you're going for is that kind of slippery, ambiguous idea of saturation. And that comes when you've really covered all the relevant
coming
literature
out.
and you've reached
But,
that point
certainly that
where,
process of
you're not
researching and
gaining new
writing,
information
eventually you
that
need
is
to
really pertinent to your work. So you've done enough. And that's really going to vary from study to study.
I
And
had a
so
question
if you
actually,
are,
if Megan.
if you're
Oh, no,
having
go ahead
doubts
if you
about
had one.
that,
Sorry.
or about the amount of information you're including, I would
Okay,
talk to
I'll
your
go ahead.
chair,
Carrie, we had a question
to
a
make
student was
sure that
asking
you've
about, and
really done, that you've gone enough in depth, enough breadth, but not too much. And it does end up being subjective. Was there anything else? Sure. Well, typically in an annotated bibliography, you're presenting, a block of, you're
yeah.
writing an extended explanation or
Well,
extended
most of
summary of
the
each
things,
source. And there might be some analytical elements in an annotated bibliography where you're indicating its
in the
relevance to your
Q&A
work,
box are
but
thanks
typically
now, Carrie.
you're
So
going
do you have
you're
any
definitely
last
going
thoughts
source
before
by
we wrap
source
up
in an
for today?
annotated bibliography. And so a matrix can be a good first step actually toward that annotated bibliography because you're pulling out in those categories, in those columns, like in the examples I showed you, all of the things that you want to cover about each source. And then in keeping notes in there, using, and again, using quotation marks and stuff if you're taking words directly from the article is helpful. That will provide you like a really great framework or scaffold for writing out that material. Now, when you go into synthesizing that into your literature review, you are unlikely to want to take, big blocks of text from your annotated
Thanks so
bibliography
much,
and plug
Carrie, and
those
thank
into
you,
the literature
Megan, for all
review
of your work in the
because that again
background.
is going to go source
Carrie, it
by
was a
source by
fantastic
source, and
presentation,
it's
and
not.
Megan, you flew through those questions really quickly in responding to them throughout the session. So thank you to you all. Thank you everyone for attending. We hope this was useful, and do reach out, as Carrie said, and check out those other resources that are linked throughout the slides at the end here.